Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Well, hello, and thank you for joining me today. In today's talk, I'd like to look at some of the massive religious changes which ordinary English men and women faced between 1534 and 1559, and at some of the ways in which they coped with these during the 25-year period in question. I'll also be looking a little at the area of Westminster in all this as well. Before and after the great religious changes known as the Reformation of the 16th century, the life of the community, whether in village, town or city, was centered on the local parish church. This was where people were baptized, married and buried. This is where the sacraments were administered, and this was, above all, the place where ordinary people met, encountered, discussed and dealt with religious changes which would have seemed inconceivable at the beginning of the 16th century. The church they entered in the 1530s would in all probability not have had pews. People stood or knelt on the stone floor. Images of saints, either painted on the walls or as statues, were numerous. Stained glass windows told biblical stories. And depending on the size of the church, there would be side chapels off the nave. Candles burnt on side altars and before images. However, most people's attention would have centered on what was called the rood screen, stretching across most of the eastern part of the church. Rood is an Old English word for the cross, and it was this with Christ upon it, which would have been set above the screen with images of the Virgin Mary and St. John standing on either side of the cross. On the lower panels of the screen, there might be painted images of the saints and or biblical characters. But beyond this, and mainly out of the sight of the congregation, stood the holiest part of the church, the main or high altar, where the parish priest would celebrate the very central part of religious life, the Mass. During this, all believed that the communion bread and wine consecrated by the priest was transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ, the real presence. However, by the 1530s, was it true that all believed this? Since the late 1300s, there had been a denial of all this by a small but sometimes vocal group in England of those who followed the teachings of a 14th century priest called John Wycliffe. These people were often called Lollards, probably after the Dutch verb lollen, to mumble, as their beliefs were mainly kept in a low-key fashion. The authorities had stamped down heavily on this heresy, with some Lollards even being burnt at the stake for their beliefs. But with the reforming ideas of Martin Luther and others seeping in from the continent, and King Henry VIII's abolishing of papal authority through the Act of Supremacy of 1534, which made him supreme head of the Church in England, such heretical thoughts might have seemed to have been given a boost. On the other hand, the rejection of the Pope's authority in England would have been extremely hard to accept by the majority, and some suffered greatly for their inability so to do. For example, Sir Thomas More, the ex-Lord Chancellor, who was beheaded in 1534, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, who faced the same death in 1535, and the prior of the great Carthusian monastery in Clerkenwell, known as the Charterhouse, John Houghton, who was hanged, drawn and quartered in the same year. However, some people's concerns were quite possibly assuaged by the king's conservatism in other religious matters. Worried about religious uncertainties and the influence of some reformers, in 1539 Parliament passed the Act of 6 Articles, which can be seen as an attempt to end what were becoming to be known as Protestant ideas. In this, the denial of the real presence in the Mass, the celibacy of the clergy and the effectiveness of one-to-one confession were made serious offences. Those attending church and inclined to reform probably held back their beliefs when the news filtered through of the public burnings of those the authorities deemed to possess dangerous heretical ideas. For example, Anne Askew from Lincolnshire, who was arrested on more than one occasion for her reformist beliefs. In June 1546, after being put to the torture in the Tower of London, she was condemned to be burnt at the stake. The sentence was carried out in Smithfield on the 16th of July 1546, with Anne being carried to the stake in a chair due to her injuries from the torture. Other burnings had already taken place or had occurred in places such as Windsor, Colchester and Salisbury. One small but revolutionary change amongst all this religious conservatism was the provision of the Bible in English in every church during 1539 and 1540. This was not to be read by the laity, but now when the priest used it, they could hear and understand the Word of God in their own language and not Latin. So, for the time being, religious life continued much as it had done for time immemorial. Yes, religious houses had completely vanished by 1540, but what had gone on in the local church for centuries continued. Mass in Latin, veneration of the saints and the Virgin Mary, the celebration of a multitude of church festivals, and prayers for the dead. The latter was based on a belief in purgatory, where all but the most saintly or most evil went after death. Purgatory was where people atoned for their sins on earth before reaching heaven. Nobody knew how long a stay in purgatory would be, but it was thought that prayers and the celebration of masses for those who had died would shorten this stay. This led to the creation of so-called chantries, which were established in churches and where a priest could celebrate a daily or even more frequent masses for the departed. Over the centuries, money, land and property were donated to the church for the upkeep of these ceremonies, much of it by the rich and by those representing groups of powerful individuals, such as those formed by various trades and crafts, the great livery companies of London, for example. Not all so-called religious fraternities represented the upper ranks of society. For example, local farmers might make modest endowments of agricultural produce to a fraternity dedicated to a particular saint. This might involve the burning of a torch during Mass to honour the saint, prayers for departed members in purgatory, and the provision of charitable works for the poor and sick. Poorer people could perhaps pay for the saying of an occasional Mass for their departed loved ones, whereas those who were even poorer might be able to only cover the cost of a candle burning before an altar once a year. Anything, however small, was deemed to be of help. By the mid-1540s, verbal attacks on the veneration of images, many at diocesan level, had probably made the average person think twice about showing support for some of the traditional forms of religion. But with the death of Henry VIII in 1547 and the accession of his young son Edward VI, things moved dramatically onto the path of reform. The new king was only 9 years old when he ascended the throne, but his education had been in the hands of those inclined to reform, and continued so at the hands of the Duke of Somerset, appointed Lord Protector of the child king. As prayers for the dead and the belief in purgatory were now no longer held to be valid, the Chantries Act of 1547 swept away all the remaining religious fraternities and guilds in the country. The religious principles involved were matched by the Crown's confiscation of all that belonged to the chantries: plate, ornaments, vestments and other church goods. In addition, all land and other wealth donated to them were forfeit too. There was the Brotherhood of Our Lady in St Dunstan, in the Church of St Dunstan in the East Fleet Street in London, and this brought the Crown several sums ranging from about £6 per annum down to 13 shillings and 4pence per annum, all donated for masses for various individual souls and for poor relief. The Fraternity of the Holy Trinity and St Mary the Virgin in Hackney Parish Church, Middlesex, brought in £8 per annum. In the parish of South Mimms in Middlesex, various bequests of cows had been made to provide income paying for lamps before the altar and poor relief. These provided sums varying from 5 shillings to 1 and 4 per annum. Now, in the Westminster area, St Margaret Westminster, the Fraternity of Our Lady, brought in £55 10 shillings per annum from lands and tenants. St Clement Danes, there was a charity in honour of the 5 Wounds of Christ. This brought in £4 per annum. And at St Martin in the Fields, there was an obit or remembrance for Christopher Norris, which brought in 10 shillings per annum. Although seemingly small to us, these are considerable sums for the times. Disappointingly for the authorities, some churches such as Acton in Middlesex brought in nothing. Perhaps the parishioners in these areas had already caught wind of what was coming and had already wound up their fraternities. Despite the fact that some commentators of the period maintained that belief in purgatory and prayers for the departed had been dying out by the late 1530s and 40s, quite possibly the average parishioner would have been quite bewildered by all this change. On the other hand, some must have welcomed these reforms and all those which followed. Images and stained glass windows were removed from churches, sometimes with great violence. Religious paintings on walls were whitewashed. Remaining rood screens were taken down. The use of rosaries at prayer was deemed totally unnecessary. Services were in English, which also meant that most choral music could not be used either. And most revolutionary of all, as what had been called the sacrifice of the Mass was no longer valid, the dismantling of all altars in the country by late 1550. These were replaced by communion tables, which were set up in the main body of the church, surrounded by the congregation, a far cry from the days when the priest celebrated Mass on an altar behind the rood screen out of the sight of the laity. Here, once more, ordinary people had to make the decision to conform or not. It would seem that most did, as some of what was happening pleased some. Others might have felt that if the vicar conformed, it must be the right thing to do, and others probably hid their feelings and dissembled. Massive liturgical change came with the introduction of the first Book of Common Prayer in 1549. Most believed that this was entirely the work of Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, but there seems to be no definite proof of this. He and possibly others based much of it on what was contained in the so-called Sarum Rite, Latin liturgy used in the Diocese of Salisbury, the Diocese of York, and also Bangor and Lincoln since the 13th century. All of it was entirely in English and contained orders for matins, evensong, the various introits and collects, epistles and gospels to be read at services, baptism, confirmation, matrimony, burial, the form of the litany, and most importantly, the supper of the Lord, commonly called the Mass. Details of the services for the consecration of archbishops, bishops, priests and deacons were included, and there was also a section explaining why certain ceremonies had been retained or left out. As the Reformers were still not satisfied with this liturgy, another Book of Common Prayer was issued in 1552. This moved the Church in a much more Protestant direction, dropping of the term Mass, and included a form of words which indicated that the service of Holy Communion was a memorial of Christ's death and not a reenactment of it. Any lingering trace of requiem prayers for the dead in the burial service was removed. By this time, priestly vestments, once so much of the religious life in a parish, had been reduced to the simple surplice. So much had altered, and so quickly since the accession of King Edward VI, that some might have felt themselves to be punch drunk by the changes. Nevertheless, the exposure to what the Catholic historian Professor Eamon Duffy calls the matchless and memorable dignity of Cranmer's English services must have had an immense effect on many who had not been able to follow religious ceremonies in Latin. With Edward's death in 1553 and the accession of his half-sister Mary I, who had never conformed to the reforms of her father and brother's reigns, the return to traditional Catholic religion was underway. The Mass was restored in December of that year, and churches and cathedrals throughout the land reintroduced rites, traditions and decorations that had been so recently abolished. Despite the confiscation and/or destruction of a huge amount of traditional items such as vestments, chalices and missals, many are agreed that numerous parishes all over the country had managed to hide such artifacts and to bring them out again for the new reign. Others commissioned new items which had been totally lost. In December 1554, Parliament passed a bill reuniting England with Rome and revoking the title of Supreme Head of the Church for the English monarch. And on the 25th of January 1555, the feast of the conversion of St. Paul, this reconciliation was marked by the celebration of masses and processions in cathedrals and churches everywhere. Everything seemed to be in place to turn back the clock of religious life in England to the world it had known before the massive reforms of the last 20 years or so. But was this so? In February 1554, the head of the newly restored image of Thomas Becket in the Mercers Company Chapel in Cheapside, London, was knocked off during the night. In January 1555, a Thomas Rose and his followers were arrested in Bow Churchyard in London for celebrating Holy Communion according to the Book of Common Prayer. On Easter Sunday, 1555, a William Flower stabbed the priest at the high altar in St. Margaret, Westminster, as he was celebrating Mass. And in December 1557, there was trouble in Islington, Middlesex, when a group of people gathered at the Saracen's Head Inn ostensibly to attend a play, but in reality to take part in a service of Holy Communion according to the Book of Common Prayer. Conformity was the norm for most, but these events show that the seed of Reformation was still bearing fruit. It's fair to ask whether this point of view was sustained by the burning of heretics. This was nothing new in England, but the country had never before seen the relentless pursuit of so many religious deviants in so short a time. Upward of 300 were burnt at the stake, from the highest in the land, such as Thomas Cranmer, former Archbishop of Canterbury in 1556, to simple folk such as carpenters, butchers and housewives. Support for the authorities there was, but support for those about to be executed was evident too. For example, in late 1555, a large crowd gathered at Stratford in Essex to greet a band of heretics being taken from Colchester in Essex to Smithfield for burning. By the time the prisoners arrived in London, the crowd of supporters had increased to around 1,000. Tellingly, on the 14th of June 1556, the City of London authorities ordered householders to keep their apprentices and servants at home when Smithfield executions were to take place. Why issue such an order if people witnessing a burning accepted what was happening with pious devotion? The last burnings took place on the 15th of November 1558, and on the 17th of November, Queen Mary died. Although she had outwardly conformed in her sister's reign, the young Queen Elizabeth's religious tendencies were made evident when, on Christmas Day after becoming monarch, she told the Bishop of Carlisle in her private chapel not to elevate the host, the consecrated bread, during Mass. When he did so, she left the service. At the state opening of Parliament in January 1559, she told the abbot and monks of Westminster Abbey to extinguish their tapers. "Away with those torches, we can see well enough," were her words. Nevertheless, a proclamation of late December 1558 allowed much of Mary's restoration of Catholic ceremonies to continue, and the new Queen's coronation in January 1559 was a more or less Catholic service, although it's thought that Elizabeth retired to a private chapel in Westminster when Mass was celebrated during the event. There was no immediate, headlong rush to reform. Elizabeth showed her true religious colours when the Act of Uniformity was passed in April 1559. This meant that as from the 24th of June, 1559, churches throughout the country had to conform to the changes made late in King Edward VI's reign. Out went the altars, the Mass and the images and the greater part of Catholic ritual, and in came a new Book of Common Prayer which was based on that of 1552. Many reformers who had left England under Mary came back, and like some of those who had stayed, were not happy with the new religious regime, as it confirmed episcopal government, kneeling to receive communion, and the wearing of certain priestly vestments, for example. The petition in the litany for the deliverance from the tyranny of the Bishop of Rome and all his detestable enormities was dropped as well. The monarch was no longer held to be the supreme head of the church, but supreme governor. And communicants received the sacrament with these words: "The body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving." Clearly a compromise which covered both those who believed in the real presence and those who did not. Vestments were limited to the surplice, but a cope could be worn for the celebration of the Holy Communion, especially on feast days. And it was understood that surviving stained glass windows, not based on controversial themes such as the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, could remain unless they were damaged and needed to be reglazed. Stained glass had probably survived in some churches for one of two reasons: protection by the local congregation, or the realization that for very large churches, the replacement of all stained glass with plain glass would have entailed a considerable outlay of money. Unknowingly at the time, all this was to lead to many problems in the future, when those who were to be known as Puritans, who were not satisfied with the religious reforms in England, strove to purify the church from within, and this resulted in the political religious civil war of the next century. What did ordinary men and women think of all this? There must have been a good deal of confusion, as after all there had been 3 monarchs since 1547, and who could say whether the new young queen would only be on the throne for a short time, with yet more changes to come after she died? Many of those so inclined to reform must have been happy with the restoration of the prayer book, and those of a more conservative nature might have found some comfort in what they encountered in it. The use of terms priest as well as minister to describe the officiant at various services. The celebration of certain saints' days and other feasts, such as the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Annunciation, the use of the Magnificat and Evensong, details of vigils and fasts to be kept, and somewhat surprisingly, tucked into the lessons proper for holy days, of the lessons to be read on the Annunciation of Our Lady. Perhaps others were prepared to bide their time, in the hope of better things, should the Queen's reign be a short one. Those who could not accept the return to reform faced many difficulties, as what turned out to be a very long reign progressed. Punishment, sometimes very, very harsh punishment, was meted out to those who clung to the old ways. But mercifully, England was spared the extremely violent and bloody wars of religion which swept through France in the second half of the 16th century. So by the middle of 1559, the life of each community in England was still very much centred on the local church. But the building itself and what went on in it bore little resemblance to what could have been found there in the earlier part of the century. Many ordinary English men and women who had lived through 25 years of fairly conservative religious reform, then revolutionary reform, followed by a short-lived return to traditional forms of religion, probably accepted what has been called the Elizabethan Compromise with some relief. At least it offered the prospect of some stability in their lives. Others, inclined to either Puritanism or Catholicism, faced some bitter choices in the years ahead, but these are worthy of another talk at some stage. Thank you very much for listening to me today.